You got somewhere to stay?
Not yet.
Then you'd best come with me till we think what's next.
Letters and Dust, June 1879. The stagecoach wheeled to a stop in a cloud of gray dust and wind. Bitter Creek didn't look like the kind of place a woman should arrive alone. Just a scatter of wooden buildings clinging to the wide, empty plain, the color of bone and smoke. Clara Hastings stepped down clutching a single trunk and a folded letter worn soft from her hands. The driver tipped his hat. "End of the line, ma'am." She nodded. Her boots sank into the grit. A church bell tolled somewhere in the wind, one long note that sounded less like welcome than remembrance. She stared at the paper again, the ink faded but steady. "My name is Robert Callen. If you choose to come west, you'll find me in Bitter Creek, near the river bend. I can promise honest work, a roof, and my word to keep you safe." He had written that in February. 3 months later she was here, and he was gone. The postmaster's eyes had softened when he told her, "Callen's been buried 2 weeks, ma'am." Fever took him sudden. The letter slipped from her fingers that day, catching a drift of dust before settling flat against the ground, like it had reached its final address after all. Now the town watched her in that quiet way. Western towns did, faces half curious, half guarded. A woman alone meant trouble or tragedy. No one asked which. She found the small churchyard by following the trail of cottonwood leaves. The grave was simple: Robert Callen, 1845-1879. A good man. She knelt, tracing the name with gloved fingers, feeling nothing at first but the sting of wind in her eyes. She had come to be a wife. Instead, she was a widow who'd never been kissed. A man's voice broke the stillness. "You must be Miss Hastings." She turned. The man standing there was tall coat buttoned to his throat hat pulled low against the wind. His eyes were gray, not cold, but heavy like weather that might change without warning. "I was his friend," he said. "Silas Walker. Marshal here once." He took off his hat. "Robert spoke of you often, said you had a steadiness about you." "I only wrote him letters," she murmured. "Sometimes that's steadier than words said out loud." He helped her to her feet. His hands were rough, scarred across the knuckles, the kind of hands that remembered violence, but didn't reach for it anymore. Behind him, the wind carried the smell of pine and rain, promising a storm. "You got somewhere to stay?" he asked. She looked past him toward the plain where the river cut silver through the distance. "Not yet." "Then you'd best come with me till we think what's next. The Callen ranch is empty, but it still stands." She hesitated. "You don't know me, Marshal." He met her gaze steady as the horizon. Robert did. "That's enough to start." They rode in silence through the pale dusk. The land unrolled around them, dust and grass, sagebrush bending like old prayers. When the cabin came into view, half hidden by cottonwoods, she almost stopped breathing. It was small, lonely, and yet lit. By the faintest glow from its window, it looked like the world's last promise of warmth. Silas swung down, tied his horse, and opened the door for her. Inside, the air smelled of cedar smoke and rain-damp wood. He struck a match, lit the lamp, and the light fell on 2 mugs, a tin kettle, and the ghost of a life interrupted. Clara set her trunk down. He said this place had a view of the stars. Silas nodded. He wasn't wrong. They come close enough to touch out here. She turned toward the window. The wind pressed against the glass, carrying dust and distant thunder. Her heart beat slow, uncertain, but not afraid. For the first time since she'd stepped off the coach, she felt something that might become steadiness. Outside, the first drop of rain hit the roof, a single soft sound. Then another, then many. The stranger's promise. The rain lasted all through the night, soft, steady like a hand smoothing the anger out of the land. When dawn came, Bitter Creek shimmered in a faint silver mist. The world smelled of wet dust and pine of ashes washed clean. Clara woke to the sound of boots outside the cabin. For a long, drowsy second, she thought it was Robert, returning from the line fence, his whistle cutting through the morning air. But then the sound changed, the rhythm slower, deliberate. She blinked toward the doorway, saw the empty chair across the room, and remembered. Robert was gone. The ache returned quietly like breath under a wound. Outside, Silas Walker was splitting firewood. His shirt clung damp to his back, the steady swing of the axe punctuated by the low rasp of breath. He didn't look like a man working for warmth. He looked like a man keeping a promise. She stepped to the threshold, shawl drawn close. "You were a marshal once," she said softly, "but not anymore." He paused. Mid-swing rested the axe against the stump. "Not for some time. Too many ghosts in that badge. You quit, got asked to step down." He half smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Folks prefer their lawmen spotless. I wasn't." The air was cool and clean, carrying the hush that follows long rain. She glanced at his hands, scarred rough, half-healed, and said, "You could have left this place." "I tried." He looked toward the gray line of hills. "But the past rides faster than a horse. Might as well face it where it found me." A blue jay shrieked from the pines, loud and lonely. Clara folded her arms tighter, her breath turning to fog in the chill. The silence between them was not empty. It held all the unspoken things they didn't dare name. She thought of the long train ride west, the letter folded and refolded in her glove. The ache in her chest each time she whispered Robert's name to keep from crying. Silas stacked the wood, dusted his palms, and turned to her. "Robert left debts here. Small ones, but they hang over his land. I'll settle them for now. You can stay in the house till you decide what you want done with it." Her eyes lifted sharply. "I don't have money to pay you. I didn't ask for any." "Then why help me?" He studied her for a moment as if the question itself had weight. "Because he would have wanted it, and because maybe I owe him more than I can pay." There was something low and worn in his voice, guilt wrapped in gentleness that made her pulse quicken. She wanted to ask what debt he meant, but didn't. Truth could wait. The day unfolded quiet and wide. The storm had left the valley scattered with branches and silver puddles that reflected the sky. They spent the morning mending what the wind had torn. She cleaned the cabin, sweeping out the mud that had crept under the door. The floor creaked under her bare feet. In every corner, she found traces of a life half-lived. A hymn book with a pressed violet, a pipe carved with initials, a shirt folded neatly in a drawer that had never been worn. Outside, Silas repaired the roof, replaced the broken hinge, rode into town for nails and feed. When he came back, the light was fading into that tender gold the valley was named for. Evenings they shared coffee on the porch, the world going amber and quiet around them. He talked little, but his silence wasn't cold. It was careful. She filled it with the sound of spoons tapping mugs, the rustle of her shawl, the faint hum of a hymn she couldn't finish. One night she said Robert used to write about this place. Said the land makes a person honest. Silas looked toward the horizon where the mist was turning violet. It does. Out here nothing hides long. The wind tells on everyone. She smiled faintly. Then, I suppose it'll tell on me too. His gaze met hers, steady as an oath. Maybe it already has. The words hung between them close enough to burn. He looked away, first thumb brushing the brim of his hat. "You'll need to visit town tomorrow. There's paperwork about the property." She nodded, though her stomach tightened at the thought. The next afternoon they rode into Bitter Creek together. The trail wound through wet sage and low fog. Her borrowed mare splashed through puddles, the air cool on her face. Silas rode ahead, the back of his coat dark with rain stains. The town appeared like something remembered, a handful of buildings, gathered by the creek smoke, curling from a smithy, the faint chime of a bell above the telegraph office. At the general store, the floorboards creaked beneath her boots. The townsfolk watched her with the polite suspicion reserved for newcomers and widows. Women paused their gossip behind the counter. One man near the barrels muttered, "Male bride come too late." Clara stiffened. She focused on the shelves, jars of nails, lamp oil, sacks of beans, anything but the pity in their eyes. Then Silas's shadow fell over the man like the coming of a storm. "That'll be enough," he said quietly. The store fell silent. The man looked away, the color rising in his neck. Outside, Clara said, "You didn't have to do that." He adjusted his gloves, his tone flat. "Didn't seem right to let lies stand?" "They weren't lies," she murmured. "I did come too late." He stopped walking. "Maybe not. Maybe you came when someone else needed you more." She looked up, startled. His eyes softened, then hardened again, the moment closing like a gate. "Come on," he said. "Sun's falling." That night the sky cleared. Wind whispered through the pines. She sat by the lamp rereading Robert's last letter. The words were faded from her handling. "I'll have a roof mended before you arrive, love. The land's rough but good. I think you'll like the quiet." The paper trembled in her hands, not from cold but from the question that had begun to live inside her chest. If Robert was gone, what promise was she still bound to keep, and to whom? Outside, Silas's horse shifted restlessly. Through the window she saw him standing by the fence, shoulders bowed, head low beneath the moon. He looked like a man praying without words. When he came in, the lamplight brushed the lines of his face, tired, handsome in a weathered way. "Thank you," she said. "For what? For making it easier to breathe here?" He nodded, almost shy. "Good night, Miss Hastings." "Good night, Marshal." The title slipped out before she could stop it. Something in his eyes flickered surprise, maybe pain. Then he turned away. After he'd gone to his bunk by the hearth, she lay awake, listening to the quiet, the hiss of cooling wood, the faint sigh of rain returning against the window. Each sound was a reminder that she wasn't alone anymore, though neither of them quite knew what that meant. The following days blurred into a rhythm that felt borrowed from a dream. Silas rose early, the sound of his boots marking each hour like a clock. She cooked, sometimes out of habit, sometimes out of longing. They spoke little yet. The silence began to shape itself into understanding. He showed her how to check the fences, how to tell good wire from rusted, how to mend a gate latch so it wouldn't snap under wind. She taught him how to patch a tear cleanly, how to fix a button without cursing. At noon, they'd rest under the porch eaves, sharing bread and coffee that had gone bitter on the fire. She told him about her days back east, teaching music to children who sang off-key but with joy. He told her about the towns he'd patrolled, as martial names spoken like ghosts: Carson Ridge, Red Hollow Canyon, Bluff. "There was a time," he said one afternoon, sharpening his knife, "I thought keeping peace meant keeping score. But peace doesn't come from winning. It comes when both sides stop fighting. You sound like a preacher." He gave a low laugh. "My mother would have liked that. I was more trouble than sermon material." Something softened between them then, laughter slipping in where grief had been. That evening, while the sky burned copper, she found him on the porch mending his saddle. The wind had gentled, carrying the scent of wet cedar. "You never said what debt you owed Robert," she said quietly. He looked up, eyes shadowed. "He saved my life once, out near Rattlesnake Pass. We were tracking rustlers, got ambushed in the ravine. He took the bullet meant for me." She stared at him, breath caught. "And now you're tending his widow." "I'm tending his memory," he said simply. "The rest, I don't know what to call it." She lowered her gaze. The air between them trembled, too fragile to name. Later, she found herself writing a letter she didn't intend to send. "Dear Robert, the man you trusted keeps his word. He builds fences that hold even when the land tries to forget them. I wish you could see how the hills shine after rain. I wish you could tell me what to do with this ache that isn't grief anymore." A week passed. The mist burned away. The valley turned green again. One morning she found Silas outside fixing the water trough. His shirt sleeves were rolled, the muscles in his forearms tight with work. "You shouldn't be doing that alone," she said. He glanced up. "You offering to help, I can hold the boards." He nodded. Together they worked in the sun, her skirt brushing the dust, their hands occasionally meeting over the same nail. Each touch startled her small sparks in the quiet. When they finished, he poured her a cup of water from the bucket. She drank the coolness, biting her throat. He watched her, something unreadable in his expression. "Town's talking," he said finally. "About what?" "About you staying here. About me not wearing the badge anymore. Folks like to stir mud when it's drying. Do you care?" He looked away. "I care if it hurts you." "It doesn't. You're sure?" She smiled faintly. They talked back east too. Only the words were prettier. He almost smiled. "Guess Bitter Creek ain't known for manners." "No," she said softly, "but maybe that's what I like about it." That night the wind came back, cold and sharp. The lamp flickered as they ate supper by the hearth. She ladled stew into his bowl, her hand brushing his. "I could leave," she said suddenly. "Take the morning train east. Start over. You could. But I don't want to." He looked up slowly. The silence that followed felt like the breath before a confession. Then stay, he said. Her heart stuttered, and if the past catches up, his eyes held hers steady and dark. Then, we face it, together. The fire cracked, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, Bitter Creek murmured in the dark, the same way it had since the beginning of time, carrying everything away, then bringing it quietly back. For the first time since Robert's death, Clara felt the ache in her chest ease, not vanish, but soften into something she could live beside. She set her spoon down, hands trembling slightly. Silas. Yeah. Do you ever stop blaming yourself? He stared into the fire. Not yet. Maybe someday, she whispered. Maybe that's the promise you keep, to let yourself be forgiven. He didn't answer. But when he reached across the table, his fingers brushed hers, and that was enough. Outside, the wind lifted, carrying the scent of pine and rain over the roof. Inside, two people who had lost too much sat together in the half-light, holding the quiet like a fragile truce. And somewhere between the hiss of the fire and the murmur of the creek, a new kind of promise began to take shape, one not made of duty or debt, but of the simple, stubborn mercy of staying. Cabin of the Unspoken. The storm came down from the northern ridge, without warning, a wall of gray swallowing the horizon, the kind that could strip a man from his saddle before he had time to curse the sky. By mid-afternoon, the wind was already clawing at the shutters. Silas rode in from the lower pasture, coat-soaked, dark hat dripping, leading the horse with one hand and carrying the last sack of feed with the other. Mud caked his boots to the ankles. Rain streaked off him in ropes as he climbed the steps. "Close the windows," he called over the roar. "This one's mean." Clara ran to latch them. The cabin trembled, every joint creaking under the wind's assault. When she turned, he was there, wet hair clinging to his brow, breath rough from the ride. He set the sack down and leaned against the door, watching her in the flickering lamplight. "You've seen worse?" she asked, half smiling to hide her unease. He nodded. "Worse, yes, but not with company worth keeping." Something quick and dangerous passed between them, soft as the flame that caught in the stove. She busied herself with the kettle, pretending she hadn't heard. Outside, the storm let out a deep animal groan. Rain struck the roof in wild rhythm, 1,000 hooves galloping over wood. The lamplight thinned gold, fighting gray. Silas peeled off his coat, hung it by the door, then crouched near the stove to feed the fire. Steam rose from him like breath. "Wind out of the north'll bring hail before dark," he said. "Does it ever spare this valley? Not the parts worth keeping." She smiled faintly at the echo. His words always carried the shape of something older, truth-earned, not spoken for effect. By the time dusk came, the ridge was gone from sight. Rain turned to sleet, hammering the roof so hard she feared it might cave. The small cabin, sturdy as it was, shuddered beneath each gust. Silas had taken off his gun belt and hung it near the door. Clara sat near the stove, mending a tear in her shawl needle, trembling with every crack of thunder. Her hair was half undone, the fire catching glints of copper in it. He watched her hands for a long time before speaking. "You've got a steady way about you. Doesn't seem right for someone who's lost as much as you have." She looked up slowly. "You talk like you know the measure of my losses." He leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking. "Maybe I do, maybe not. I've buried my share of what mattered. What did you bury, Silas?" The wind moaned through the chinks of the wall, as if it meant to answer for him. "Names," he said finally. "A few men who didn't deserve it, one who did. And a piece of myself along with them." The words landed between them like something heavy dropped on a table. For a moment, she could almost hear the unsaid ones rustling behind them, regrets he didn't trust the air to hold. "You carry that badge still?" she asked quietly. He shook his head. "No, just the weight of it." She set the needle down, thread trailing through her fingers. "Then maybe you haven't buried as much as you think. If there's still weight, there's still something alive under it." A small, reluctant laugh escaped him, more breath than sound. "You've got a way of making a man feel seen, Miss Hastings." "I'm a poor judge of men," she said. "But I've learned a steady fire keeps longer than a bright one." He stared into the flame. "You talk like Robert used to." Her breath caught. "You said you were his friend." "I was." His voice dropped, roughened by memory. "He rode with me once years back, before he settled here. And you left him, I left the life. He stayed, got himself straight, I figured he'd earned his peace. His jaw worked. Didn't expect it to end before it began. Lightning painted the window white. For an instant, the grief in his face showed bare and unguarded, no marshal's mask, no silence to hide behind. She wanted to reach for him, but something held her still. Respect, fear, or maybe the strange reverence that comes when one soul recognizes the hurt in another. Thunder rolled long and low. Then the cabin filled with silence, not the absence of sound, but the kind that feels alive, aware. Hours crawled by. The wind never stopped, only changed its voice. Clara poured 2 mugs of coffee and carried one to him. "You think the roof'll hold?" He accepted it, their fingers brushing. "It's held through worse." He took a sip. "Like us." She studied the dark liquid swirling in her cup. Steam rose between them like a fragile prayer. "Silas," she said quietly, "why do I feel like there's more? You're not saying he met her gaze steady this time?" "Because there is." A gust rattled the shutters. The lantern flame guttered, then steadied again. "There's a reason I came to Bitter Creek before you," he said. "A reason I couldn't leave when Robert died." Her pulse slowed heavy. "You can tell me when you're ready? I'm not sure you'll want to hear it. Then I'll decide that myself." He looked away, eyes reflecting the firelight. "Robert wasn't the only one who wrote letters back then. He told me about you, about the woman he meant to marry when the ranch was in order. When he died, I couldn't let it sit. The debts, the land, you. I owed him more than a grave, and a promise kept on paper." Her lips parted, but no words came. The thought of him reading Robert's letters, of knowing her name before she ever knew his, made something twist in her chest. Was it pity, she asked? He shook his head. "Pity dies fast. This, whatever I'm trying to make right, it doesn't." Rain drummed harder, muting the world to a rhythm of breath and heartbeat. She looked down at the quilt on her lap, the tiny stitches neat and even. "You could have written. You could have told me." "I thought about it." He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Then I figured a letter from me wouldn't bring comfort to a widow waiting for the man I couldn't save." She flinched at the honesty of it. "Did he suffer?" Silas's jaw tightened. "Not long. He took the shot meant for me. I've carried that ever since." The storm swallowed his words, but the confession stayed. "You came here to make it right," she said. "I came here because I didn't know where else to go." Something in his tone, defeat, exhaustion, perhaps even relief, touched her more deeply than she wanted. The lamp flickered low. Shadows leaned across the walls like restless spirits. Near midnight, the storm began to ease. The roof no longer groaned. The wind slipped into softer whispers around the chimney. Clara poured what remained of the coffee, now gone lukewarm, and handed him a cup. "Seems the sky's forgiven us." "Sky doesn't forgive," he said, voice rough with fatigue. "It just forgets." She studied him, his eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights, the faint tremor in his hands as he took the cup. "Maybe forgetting's the closest thing to mercy we get." He looked at her, and something like agreement passed between them. When the lamp finally dimmed, she rose to check the door. He followed her with his gaze, the quiet intimacy of shared survival, stretching thin and taut between them. "You should rest," he said. "Long day tomorrow. Fences will be down again." "So will half the valley," she replied softly. He smiled, the smallest break in all that weathered stoicism. "Then we'll start with ours." She lingered near the table, the quilt draped over her shoulders. "You really think it's possible mending what the storm takes?" His eyes moved over her face, slow and searching. "Maybe not all of it, but maybe that's not the point. Sometimes you fix what you can just to prove you're still here." The words settled in her chest like warmth after cold water. When she finally went to her bed, the sound of rain had turned to a soft tapping. She closed her eyes to it, letting it lull her toward sleep. But sometime before dawn, she woke. The lamp had burned out. Only the red hush of embers lit the room. Silas sat in the chair by the door, hat tipped low, his revolver resting across his thigh, not in threat, but in the practiced ease of a man who trusted neither quiet nor dreams. For a long moment, she watched him, the way his chest rose slow, and shallow the lines around his mouth softened by sleep. The firelight traced him in bronze. She rose, careful not to wake him, and took the old quilt from her bed. When she laid it gently over his shoulders, he stirred. "You don't have to," he murmured. "I know," she whispered. "Neither do you." Outside, the storm broke into drizzle soft as forgiveness, steady as dawn, beginning somewhere beyond the hills. By morning, the world was washed clean. Mist hung low over the valley, drifting like ghosts, reluctant to leave. The creek ran high, carrying broken branches and glints of sunlight through the flooded grass. Silas stood on the porch studying the damage. Clara came beside him with 2 tin cups of coffee. He accepted one, their fingers brushing again. "Looks worse than it is," he said. "You said that last time. And it was true last time too." She smiled. "You ever tire of being right?" He took a sip. "Doesn't happen often enough to be tiring." She laughed quiet, surprised, the sound startling even her. It had been months since laughter felt like something that belonged to her. They worked side by side that day, clearing fallen limbs, righting the feed barrels, checking the horses. The air smelled of mud and cedar. Every now and then she'd glance toward him, and each time found him already looking back. At noon, when they rested by the fence line, he handed her a piece of bread and said, "You ever think of leaving this place? Every night since I came," she said honestly, "and every morning I find a reason to stay." He nodded once, as if that made sense. "I keep thinking of what you said last night," she added, "about fixing what you can, just to prove you're still here." Sounded wiser than it was, he said, breaking a twig between his fingers. "It was enough," she answered. He looked up then, eyes catching the thin sunlight. "Maybe that's all any of us get. Enough." They sat quiet a while, listening to the wind move through the wet grass. Somewhere far off a meadowlark called. Clara felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she hadn't known she'd tied. When they walked back to the cabin, the door creaked open to the smell of drying wood and the faint echo of last night's rain. Inside, everything felt different, not new but steadier, as though the storm had taken only what the past no longer needed. Silas set his hat on the peg and said almost to himself, "Place feels less empty with 2 voices in it." Clara glanced around at the rough walls, the patched furniture, the light slanting across the table. "It feels honest," she said. He looked at her, then really looked the woman who had arrived in mourning black and now stood with dirt on her hands and color in her cheeks. "I was wrong," he said quietly, "about what I bury. Some things you can't keep in the ground." She didn't ask what he meant. She only reached to pour them each another cup of coffee, the sound of liquid filling the silence between them. Outside, Bitter Creek shimmered in the light brown and swollen but alive, carrying pieces of the storm toward some faraway sea. And inside the cabin, where 2 people had endured a night of wind and confession, the unspoken settled into something like peace, fragile, steady, and real. Shadows of the past. The world after the storm looked scrubbed clean. The hills shone damp under a weak sun, each blade of grass jeweled with rain. The air smelled of sage and wet cedar, sharp and alive. A low mist curled from the creek, drifting like smoke that had forgotten its fire. Clara stepped outside with a bucket. The ground gave beneath her boots dark mud, breathing up small sighs of water. For the first time in days, the air was still enough to hear the sparrows waking in the cottonwoods. The quiet felt almost holy until she saw the tracks. Horse prints. 2 sets. One heading in from the ridge, one out. She crouched, fingertips brushing the damp edges. The impressions were fresh, no more than a few hours old. Whoever they were, they hadn't stayed long. "Silas," she called softly. He came out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, his jaw-tight shirt sleeves rolled above his elbows. He looked at the tracks once, then at her. "Don't spook," he said. "Riders came by at dawn. Asked after me." Her throat tightened. "Friends," he hesitated. "Men from the territory office. Or what's left of it. Lawmen, depends who's asking." He busied himself checking his rifle, but she saw the tremor in his hands. Not fear. Memory. The kind that creeps out of sleep and never quite leaves. "Silas," she said quietly, "if they're looking for you, you could go. I won't stop you." He looked up sharply. "And leave you here alone? Not my way." The answer landed between them, stubborn and tender. By noon they were riding into Bitter Creek. The land still glistened from the storm, the puddles reflecting sky. Their horses moved slow hooves, sucking at the softened road. The town was awake, Hammers on roofs, laughter from the saloon porch, a dog barking near the livery. But underneath the noise, there was a hum of gossip. Eyes followed them. Two strangers in yesterday's clothes, a man with a worn face, and a woman who didn't quite look like she belonged. At the general store, someone whispered, "That's him, Walker." At the sheriff's office, Silas dismounted without a word. "Wait here," he said. Clara nodded, though her pulse quickened. Through the thin glass window, she saw him talking to a man in a gray suit badge, pinned too high on his chest, the kind of shine that comes from authority untested. Another man leaned against the wall, arms crossed, expression unreadable. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the rhythm of the voices. Questions. Denials. Accusation. Then anger. The suited man jabbed a finger toward Silas's chest. Silas's shoulders went rigid. When he came out, the muscles along his jaw worked as if he were chewing regret. He handed her a folded telegram, its edges damp from his hand. "Read it." The paper was thin, creased, from being opened too many times. The words were plain and cruel. Marshal Silas Walker, wanted for questioning in the death of Robert Callen, Bitter Creek, March 1879. Her eyes froze on the name. Robert. He nodded once. It was a shootout. "I was working under a federal order. Callen was wanted on suspicion of theft, someone else's mistake. But I didn't know that then." The sounds of town faded. All she heard was the scrape of dust along the boards, and her own heartbeat thudding in her ears. "You killed him." "I shot him," Silas said quietly. "Didn't mean to kill. He drew first. I tried to take his gun hand. Missed." Clara stepped back. The street between them stretched wide as a desert. Every letter she had written to the man she'd hoped to marry, every prayer whispered to his memory, suddenly brittle things ready to crack. All this time she whispered, "You've been helping me because you feel guilty." His eyes lifted to hers, dark as storm water. "I've been helping because I couldn't bear to let him stay dead in every way." He swung into the saddle before she could answer, and they rode home in silence. The sky bruised toward evening copper, on the edges violet near the hills. The wind was warm again, but the kind that carried no comfort. Clara's hands were cold around the reins. By the time they reached the cabin, the light had thinned to gold dust. She dismounted first, walking ahead of him, not trusting herself to speak. Inside, the lamp was still burning from morning, its flame low, trembling like her breath. Silas stopped at the doorway, hat in hand. "I should have told you sooner." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He turned the hat slowly between his fingers, the gesture of a man looking for words that don't exist. "Robert wasn't the man you thought. He was trying to start clean, but he got mixed up in something bad before the end. That doesn't change what I did, but I want you to know he wasn't evil. Just tired." She stared at him. "And what are you?" "Silas, tired too." He gave a small, humorless smile. Every day since that night, the wind picked up, pushing a faint rattle through the shutters. Rain began again, soft, hesitant, like the sky couldn't make up its mind whether to cry. "You can hate me," he said finally. "I've earned that. But don't think I'm staying to wash away what can't be washed." She drew a shaky breath. "Then why stay at all?" "Because I meant what I said at his grave." Her heart stuttered. "And what was that I'd keep his word?" "What word?" "That you'd be safe here. That someone would see you through the storm." Her voice broke. "He told you that?" Silas's eyes met hers, steady, grief soft. In the last minute he had. Later, when darkness settled, she walked out onto the porch. The rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet dust and sorrow. Silas sat by the hitching post, hat at his feet, elbows on his knees. He looked smaller, somehow stripped of all the edges that made him unapproachable. "You could have lied," she said. He didn't look up. "Would have been easier." "Then why tell me?" "Because easy's what got Robert killed." The words hit harder than he meant them to. She stood beside him, arms folded tight against the cold. The stars above were sharp, and closed the sky, a dark sea of memory. "I came here to marry a stranger," she said quietly. "Seems I did." He lifted his head then, slow and deliberate. "And do you regret it?" "I don't know yet." They sat in the long quiet that follows honesty. Somewhere a coyote called, thin and mournful. She turned toward the door. Tomorrow I'll go into town. I'll talk to those men. They'll only stir the dust. Maybe some dust needs stirring. He studied her face, saw the resolve there, the kind that looks gentle until it isn't. They won't listen, Clara. They've already made their story. Then I'll tell mine. She paused, hand on the door. You said Robert wasn't evil. I think you aren't either. But that doesn't mean I forgive you. He nodded once. Fair enough. When she shut the door, he stayed where he was. The cold bit into his fingers, but he didn't move. Above him, the stars turned like old verdicts across the plain. Morning came thin and gray. Clara packed a small bundle of papers, letters, the deed, the telegram folded once more. Silas saddled the horses in silence. You sure about this? He asked. I need to know what they know. They rode slow through the waking fields. Frost glittered in the hollows. Mist clung to the creek bed. No one spoke until the town came into view, roofs shining like tin coins in the Sunday. At the sheriff's office, the gray-suited man was waiting, coffee cup steaming beside his ledger. Mrs. Hastings, he said politely when she entered. Didn't expect to see you here. I'm not here for courtesy, she replied. I came to tell you about that night in March. Silas's head turned sharply. Clara, she cut him off with a glance. You were there, she said to the lawman. But I was here when he buried Robert Callen, and I know the kind of man Silas Walker is. The man leaned back in his chair. That's so, he made a mistake, she continued, but not murder. Robert wasn't an outlaw. He was running from one. From the same men you're still protecting. The deputy in the corner shifted uncomfortably. The lawman's smile thinned. Careful, man. Accusing officers can be costly. I've already paid more than enough, she said, with a year of grief for something I didn't understand. For a moment the office was silent, except for the ticking of the wall clock. Then the lawman sighed, closing his ledger. Walker, he said, you're free to go. For now, but if the territory judge calls, you'll answer. Silas nodded once. Wouldn't dream otherwise. Outside, Clara's hands shook as she climbed into the saddle. Silas reached for the reins, stopping her. You shouldn't have done that. I couldn't let them decide the story alone. He studied her. That took courage. It took anger, she said. Courage comes later. They rode home through wind and silence. The land felt bigger, somehow like it had heard their confessions, and was deciding what to do with them. When they reached the ridge, she stopped her horse. What happens now? Silas looked toward the valley where the cabin waited in the distance. Now we do what folks do when the world's done ending. We live through it. The sun broke briefly through the clouds, gold touching his face. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked unguarded, still haunted but human again. Back at the cabin, the smell of cedar smoke greeted them. She lit the stove, stirred the fire to life. Neither spoke. Silence at last felt less like distance and more like rest. As dusk fell, Silas stepped outside. The wind carried the scent of rain again, though far off this time. Clara followed, standing beside him. You still think the past can be buried? She asked. He shook his head. No, but maybe it can be planted. She frowned. Planted, he gestured toward the ridge. Things grow on graves out here. Wildflowers, grass, if you give it time. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said softly, maybe that's enough. The sky deepened to indigo. Somewhere in the distance, thunder muttered like an old story retold. Inside the cabin, the lamp burned warm against the gathering dark. Two shadows moved across its light, the ghost of a man trying to make amends and a woman learning how forgiveness sounds before it's spoken. And for the first time in a long while, Bitter Creek felt less like a place for endings and more like a place where something, however fragile, might begin. The reckoning. The next morning broke in silence. The air was pale and sharp. Frost silvered the fence rails. The hum of the wire along the north line sounded like a tuning fork striking the cold. Silas was already saddling the horse when Clara stepped outside, shawl wrapped tight. She looked steadier than the night before, though her face carried the sleepless gray of decision. You going into town? He asked without turning. She nodded. You said those men came for answers. I think I have a few of my own. Clara, he caught himself before the rest of the words came. He had no right to ask anything of her now. The cinch creaked. Leather talked in winter syllables. She mounted her mare without help. "If you want to run, I won't stop you," she said. "But you'll have to live with the truth chasing you forever." He met her eyes. "I've been living with it already." They rode together, the cold air cutting between them like another voice. Sage brushed their boots. The creek ran high and brown, dragging a torn plank, and a memory of the storm past the cottonwoods. Bitter Creek stirred slow to life as the sun lifted. A boy carried split wood across the boardwalk. A woman shook a rug dust turning gold in the light. The two men in gray waited by the sheriff's porch dust on their boots, impatience in their eyes. One of them, tall-mustached, tipped his hat at Clara. "Ma'am, we're here on official business." "She knows," Silas said. "You Walker I was." The man unfolded a paper thumb creasing the seal line. "We need you to come to Carson for deposition. The case against your late associate's been reopened." Silas said nothing. Clara stepped forward. "What case?" The second man, younger, shifted awkwardly. "Funds missing from a mining claim. Callen's name was on it. Turns out he was being framed. Orders to bring Walker in for review." Her heartbeat stuttered. "So Robert was innocent." "Looks that way." The agent's gaze flicked to Silas. "Which means your shot killed a man with clean hands." The words struck like a hammer. The street seemed to tilt under them. A dog barked once and stopped. Silas didn't flinch, but his voice came quiet, almost a confession. "Then I'll answer for it." He unbuckled his holster, laid the gun in Clara's hands. It was heavier than she expected, oiled steel in winter weight. "No running," he said softly. The older agent took his arm. "We'll leave at dawn tomorrow. Best you get your things in order." They gave him till sundown. Men who believed paper made them merciful. That evening the town fell under a slow drizzle. Lamps bloomed behind wavering glass, small suns in a valley learning how to be quiet again. Clara stood at the cabin window, watching him pass. He moved without sound, rolling a work shirt, folding the letter she'd seen him carry, once the one in Robert's hand. He put it in last under socks. He'd darned himself like a man hiding his good silver under flour. "You mean to go?" she said. He looked up. "There's no sense hiding from what I did. And if they hang you for it, then maybe I hang clean." She crossed the room. "You did your duty. You told me." He drew first. "That don't make it right." He cinched the bag and set it by the door. Right would be a world where none of it happened. She shook her head, voice trembling. "You think dying will fix it? That it'll give Robert back his name?" "He's gone, Silas. I'm the one still here." He stared at the floorboards as if truth were nailed into them. "Then what would you have me do?" "Live," she said. "Live in a way that pays him back." Something broke open behind his eyes. Something he'd boarded over with duty and the habit of not hoping. The lamplight caught on the tears she hadn't meant to shed. She wiped them away with the heel of her hand, angry at grief for returning with a different face. "I thought you'd want me gone," he whispered. "I did," she said, "until I saw what hating you would make of me." He stepped closer, slow, as if the air between them might shatter if he moved too quick. The smell of rain and cedar lived in his coat. "I never meant for you to find out like this. I know." Her hands found the edge of his coat, holding on, as if to steady both of them. "I think Robert knew too. Maybe that's why he sent for me to finish what he started. To forgive what couldn't be undone." Outside, thunder grumbled low, far fading. The rain lightened until it was a mist that made breath look like prayer. They ate little. The stove clicked as it cooled. He slept by the door again, hat over his eyes, a man practicing leaving by inches. In the pale slice before dawn, bootsteps sounded on wet boards. 2 knocks, polite, pointless. When the agents opened the door, the cabin was empty, except for a folded note on the table heading east of the ridge. He'll answer, but not before fixing what's left broken. By the time the men reached the ridge, the tracks were already half erased by rain. The younger one swore softly. The mustached one squinted into the washed light and said, "He ain't running. He's leading." They found him 2 days later near the old mine camp, the one Callen had been accused of robbing. The place lay sullen in the wet. Damp timber leaned like old men. The smell of rust and cave water rose from the shaft mouth. A crow hopped along a broken wheelbarrow as if inventorying the losses. Silas was there, sleeves rolled, digging under a collapsed wall with a short-handled spade. Mud clung to his hands to the wrist. He moved like a man with only one thing left to do. "What are you looking for?" the younger agent asked, though he already knew the kind of answer he'd get. "Something paper forgot," Silas said, without looking up. He pried loose a warped plank. Beneath it, hidden in a pocket of dry sand, he pulled out a small lockbox with a sprung hinge and the stubborn will of tin. He jimmied it open with his belt knife. Inside, old receipts, canceled drafts, ledgers, a receipt book with Callen's name across the inside cover, in a hand Clara would have recognized. "Proof," Silas said, voice gone strange with relief and grief pulled tight together. The mustached agent took the papers and paged them with a care he didn't give people. He whistled soundlessly. "Well, hell." Language the younger one muttered, but he was smiling for the first time in 3 days. "Why bring this to us?" the older asked, glancing up. "Because truth's no good buried," Silas said. "Truth ain't the only thing gets buried out here," the man replied, but his voice had lost its edge. They conferred low and brief. Finally, the mustached agent sighed, as if mercy lived in paperwork, and made his back hurt. "You've cleared his name. You're free to go." It took a long time for the words to land. Silas stood staring at the little metal box like freedom were heavier than chains. "He had someone waiting," he said at last. "You'll make sure they know the record's clean." "We will." Silas nodded, once tucked the canceled drafts back into the box, as if tucking a shirt into a trunk, and turned his horse toward Bitter Creek. The agents watched him go. The younger said half to himself, "Man walks like he's still on a rope." "Maybe he is," the older answered. "Some ropes don't need a tree." He came down off the ridge at dusk. The valley wore the soft belly of a storm that had finally had its say. When he reached the cabin, the porch lamp was burning. Its flame made a small, stubborn halo on the wet boards. Clara stood there, wrapped in her shawl, eyes red but steady. The kind of steady you only get after shaking. "Did you find what you went for?" she asked. "Truth." He dismounted slowly, boots sighing into mud. "It don't change much. But it's something." She smiled faintly. "Then you came back. I said I would." For a long moment neither moved. Then she stepped forward and laid her hand against his chest. The heartbeat beneath was rough alive. He covered her hand with his own, as if to keep it from being carried off by the wind that always seemed a little hungry in this country. "I don't know what tomorrow means," she whispered. He touched her wrist gentle. "Then we'll start with tonight." They ate bread and stew, the kind of supper that doesn't ask for talk. After he set the lockbox on the table and opened it for her. She touched the ink with a fingertip as if proof had a temperature. "Robert's hand," she said very quietly. She traced the C in Callen. He always curled that letter like a fishhook. Silas watched her reading. "I thought about bringing it to the courthouse first," he said. "But some truths belong to the living before they belong to the law." She nodded. "Thank you." She didn't look up when she said it. The words shone on the page anyway. They sat until the lamp guttered low. Outside, the storm that had haunted Bitter Creek for weeks finally broke apart. Stars gathered shyly in the torn cloth of the clouds, thin, trembling, real. Morning brought small work, the kind that keeps hands honest and minds from kindling old fires. The chicken coop had a hinge to mend. The trough needed scraping. 2 boards along the east fence weren't seated true. They worked side by side without much speaking. Sometimes silence is the only way to tell the truth in daylight. Near noon, a wagon rattled in from town. Sheriff Fallon climbed down slow, as if gravity were more a suggestion than a rule with him. He tipped his hat toward Clara, then to Silas. Behind him, the 2 territory men rode light, empty-handed. "Papers filed," Fallon said, producing a folded notice. "Callen exonerated. You," he added to Silas, "cleared of wrongdoing in the course of duty, by order of men who keep their own rooms tidy and their boots muddy twice a year." Silas took the paper, but didn't read it. "I don't feel cleared." "Doesn't work on feeling," the sheriff said kindly. "Works on ink." He glanced at Clara. "Word in town is ugly in some mouths, gentle in others. It'll go how it goes." Clara folded her arms. If anyone asks, tell them the truth's on paper and in a box on my table. One of those is worth more than the other, Callen said, and nodded toward the house. Take care of yourselves. When they had gone, Clara took the paper from Silas and placed it under the lockbox. Let the ink stand under the hand, she said, not over it. He made a sound, half laugh, half surrender. You've a way of fixing the furniture of a day. Start where wood meets wood, she said. That's where the squeak lives. That afternoon they rode to the cemetery on the hill. The ground there always felt a little higher than the weather. Clara carried fresh wildflowers bound with twine. Silas carried nothing but the weight of his hat in his hands. At Robert's grave the wind came up. It did that sometimes, the land remembering. Clara knelt, set the bouquet against the simple wooden cross, and smoothed the earth as if it were a child's hair. They cleared you, she said softly. I told them you were worth the trouble even when you were alive. Silas stood back, hat against his thigh. He cleared his throat. When he spoke, it was not a marshal's report, and not a prayer, but something that lived halfway between. I kept your word, he said. It took longer than a man has a right to ask. But I kept it. They stayed until the sun pushed a puddle of gold between two clouds and let it run down the hill. Leaving was easier than arriving. Some griefs are shaped that way once you find where to set them down. On the ride home, Clara said, You still think dying would have made it clean? He shook his head. Dying would have made it quiet. That isn't the same. No, she said. It isn't. A hawk wrote a slow sentence above them. The wire along the west fence hummed like a low note at the end of a hymn. In town the next day, the news had already chosen its boots. Some faces softened when they saw Clara's, some tightened when they saw Silas. A woman at the dry goods counter pressed Clara's hand longer than necessary. We were wrong, she said. I was. A man on the boardwalk spat into the dust and muttered something about government men never knowing a clean shot from a dirty one. The dust swallowed both the spit and the opinion and left the day standing. Clara bought lamp oil and flour, and a paper of seeds she didn't need yet. Red willow, as if hope could be planted on a ledger the way a debt could. Silas picked up fence staples and a length of good wire. At the door he hesitated. You want to go by the sheriff's? He asked. She shook her head. Let them come by ours. They left while the sky was still thinking about evening. Spring, when it finally admitted itself, didn't apologize for being late. Grass lit the valley from the root up. The creek lost its anger and kept its voice. The ash pile by the woodbox kept shrinking. Life has a way of using what fire leaves behind. They planted the red willow cuttings just above the high water mark. Clara poured a tin cup of coffee over the damp soil, laughing at herself for wasting good brew and doing it anyway. For the roots, she said. For the road back, Silas answered. They worked the fence along the north line after that. He drove staples. She fed him wire. When a gust came off the ridge and made the strands sing, they let them sing. Sometimes music happens because the wind insists. Late, with the light leaning west, they sat on the porch steps. The air smelled of damp rope, warm pine, and something like beginning. He took the lockbox from the shelf behind the door and set it between them. I've been thinking, he said, about what lives in here. Proof, she said. And a way of not lying to ourselves, he added. We could put other things in it. The kind we don't want dust to argue with. She smiled, small and true, like what he took a folded scrap from his pocket. A letter to the judge. Not the one in the courthouse. The judge that lives in me. I started it in Carson once. He didn't finish. Read it, she said, and folded her hands the way a woman does when she means a room to be still. He read, I am not asking for a lighter name. I am asking to be allowed to use what weight is left to lift where I can. If there is a rope tied to me, let it be to pull someone out of water and not to hang myself back in March. When he finished, the evening had settled close. A nighthawk made its little world sound, cutting seams in the air. Put it in, Clara said. He did. The small click of tin was the sound of something closing without locking. Will you ever forgive me? He asked, not looking at her. She took a long time with her answer. Forgiveness is large, she said at last, but it starts small. Today I can sit beside you while the light goes. Tomorrow I can make coffee you won't drink because you say I boil it like a soldier." She smiled, and the day smiled with her. "Next week we'll see." He breathed out like a man who'd been holding the same breath since March. "I'll take small," he said. "I can carry small." She reached over and took his hand. It was the kind of touch that makes words unnecessary and vows ordinary. Behind them the lamp threw their shadows long along the wall, two shapes learning how to stand next to each other without promising they wouldn't ever fall. The stars came out thin, trembling real, and when the wind rose off the ridge and set the wire to humming, the sound wasn't warning anymore. It was a song the land sang to itself when it remembered how to be gentle. The following morning, Silas rode out early to the east pasture. The meadow there had kept its anger longer than the rest, storm-scoured and proud. He worked the corner post until it stood true. Then he sat his heels on the bottom rail and watched a fox cross the far low ground like a red comma in a sentence the hills were trying to finish. On the way back, he met Sheriff Callen half a mile from the gate. The man raised a hand. "Just checking," the sheriff said. "It's in my job to look at a place after it changes and pretend I always knew it would." Silas half smiled. "Place hasn't changed. We have." "That's how places change," Callen said. He touched his hat brim and rode on. Some men know when not to ask for coffee. When Silas reached the yard, Clara was at the porch, a kettle in one hand and a pencil behind her ear. She was making a list on the back of a folded hymn. Flour, nails, willow slips, courage. She crossed out courage and wrote kindling. Then, after a pause, she wrote courage back in smaller letters. He climbed the steps and stood in the doorway, hat in his hands, like a man who'd learned to arrive before knocking. "You're late," she said. "Fence argued," he said. "Did you win? Didn't need to? Just had to show it the shape of straight." She laughed. "Come in, Marshal." He shook his head. "Not that name, not today." She considered him. "Silas, then." "Silas will do." He passed through the door into the plain comfort of the room where storms had confessed and quiet had found a chair. On the table the lockbox weighted lid, closed edges bright, as if they'd been polished by the future itself. "Tonight," he said, "we'll take that box to town. Let the ledger in the courthouse borrow some of its truth. And after that, he said and looked at her in a way that made the room feel like a map, we plant more willow. Above the high water, where the bank remembers and still gives back." She set the kettle on, struck a match-coaxed flame into being. The fire caught a steady, ordinary miracle. The kind a life is made out of, when reckoning gives way to repair. Outside, a small wind came down from the northern ridge with nothing on it but the clean, cold breath of a day that meant what it said. The wire hummed a single low note. The note held, and in a cabin that had learned how to keep both weather and truth, two people finished, not with an ending, but with a beginning shaped like work mercy, and the long, durable sound of a promise kept. A home rebuilt spring came to Bitter Creek slowly like a weary traveler testing the road before trusting it. Snow retreated in narrow strips along the ridges, leaving dark ribbons of earth beneath. The air carried the scent of thaw-wet pine-turned soil, and the faint metallic tang of ice breaking free in the creek. Clara stood on the porch of the cabin, sleeves rolled hammer in hand. Her hair was tied under a kerchief, wisps escaping in the wind. Dust streaked her cheek where she'd brushed away sweat with the back of her wrist. Behind her, Silas worked the post-hole digger, the rhythm of steel biting into soft ground. Each strike of the blade sank easy now, the frost gone from the dirt, the land loosening its grip. "You ever built a fence before?" she called. He paused, pushing his hat back with a gloved thumb. "Built plenty. Just never one that was going to hold something worth keeping." She smiled at that. "Then best make it straight." He looked at her over his shoulder, eyes glinting under the morning light. "You planning to measure me by it?" "Maybe," she said, raising the plank. "Depends how long it stands." They worked without hurry. The land was kind that morning, cool breeze, soft clouds sliding across the Sunday. Every sound felt earned the scrape of shovel, the ring of hammer against nail, the faint whinny of the horses grazing nearby. By noon, they stopped to eat on the steps, coffee in tin cups, bread wrapped in cloth, the quiet companionship of two people who'd run out of need for pretense. Clara tore a piece of bread and looked out toward the fence line. "It feels different," she said. "What does this place?" "The quiet used to scare me. Now it sounds like breathing." Silas nodded. "The land forgives faster than people." She studied the hills, the faint green returning to their slopes. "Maybe we're both learning from it." A hawk circled overhead, its cry thin and distant. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of cedar smoke from the stove inside. They sat a while longer before returning to work. When the fence was done, it ran true posts, straight wire, tight shadowing the curve of the creek. It looked for the first time like a boundary made not to keep things out, but to hold something precious in. That evening, the cabin glowed gold in the fading light. Inside, the air smelled of pine pitch and new paint. The muslin curtains Clara had sewn hung clean and white. The roof no longer leaked when the wind shifted. The boards underfoot no longer creaked in protest. On the table between them sat two plates, one lantern, and the kind of peace that doesn't announce itself. Silas poured water into the kettle. "Tomorrow I'll ride into Red Mesa," he said. "Sell the spare mare. Pick up some seed." She looked up from her stitching. "You'll come back." He smiled, a small, honest smile. "That's the plan." She met his gaze. "You don't have to keep making promises you can't be sure of." "Then I'll make the kind I can keep," he said. "Like this one, I'll keep building if you keep staying." Her throat tightened. "That's not much of a bargain. It's enough for a start." The kettle began to hum soft and steady. She rose to pour the water, her movements sure. The lamplight caught her wrist, her hair, the steady rhythm of living remade from loss. Later, as the wind cooled, he joined her outside. The fence they'd built drew a dark line across the meadow, catching starlight in its wire. Clara said quietly, "Robert used to write that the hardest thing out here wasn't loneliness. It was learning to let someone else share it." Silas looked at her, the night reflected in his eyes. "You think he was right?" She hesitated. "I think maybe he knew we'd both need to learn it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This was his last note. "I never showed you." She took it carefully, unfolding the creased page. The handwriting was unmistakable. "Robert slanted and strong. If I don't make it, tell her the land's kinder than it looks. Tell her not to run from it." Her hand trembled. "He wrote this before you, before everything." Silas nodded. "He knew trouble was coming. He made me promise to find you if he didn't walk away." Clara looked up, tears unshed but bright. "Then I suppose you've kept your word." He shook his head slowly. "Not yet. Not till you have a reason to stay that's your own." She smiled through the ache. "Maybe I already do." The days lengthened. The creek thawed completely, singing again in its shallow bed. Life resumed its quiet insistence. They rebuilt more than the cabin. The corral took shape first, then the small tool shed. A foal Silas had found wandering by the creek became hers to care for, an awkward, long-legged creature, with a white blaze like a promise. He showed her how to trim the animal's hooves, how to check the wind for storms, before they came, how to tell by scent if the air carried snow or rain. In turn, she taught him to mend the torn lining of his coat, to keep yeast alive for bread, to find humor in the small absurdities of life. Neighbors who gossiped about miracles, they didn't understand a rooster that crowed at midnight, the stubborn mule that refused to face west. The first time she caught him smiling, for no reason, she thought, "This is what forgiveness sounds like when it finally exhales." Some evenings they rode along the ridge, watching the valley breathe itself green again. She would point to places where wildflowers had returned. He would tell her the old names of trails, long gone from maps. They spoke of the past less and less. The land did the remembering for them. One evening the sky turned lavender, the color between day and night, the hour when the world seems to hesitate before deciding which way to lean. Clara lit the lamp inside while Silas sat on the step whittling a scrap of cedar into a small carving, a bird with open wings. When she came to stand beside him, he held it out. Not much he said, but I figured the cabin could use something that remembers how to fly. She ran her thumb along the smooth curve of the wings. Then it already has. He smiled faintly. I used to think I'd never build anything that'd last. Now I figure maybe lasting isn't the point. Maybe it's just worth making while we can. Sounds like something Robert would have said. Maybe, he murmured. Maybe I finally started listening. They sat together long after the light faded. The hum of crickets stitched the night. The fence they'd built caught moonlight in its strands, glowing like silver thread drawn tight across the earth. Weeks turned into months. The valley ripened into summer. Clara planted a small patch of corn near the creek, just enough to keep her hands busy. Silas brought home a pair of calves, their cries loud and bewildered. Together they built a new gate, fitted the latch until it clicked easy. In the evenings they would sit by the open window, reading by lamplight old books, left by the preacher letters she had once written, but never sent. Some nights they said nothing at all, letting the silence breathe for them. Once during a rainstorm she caught him standing barefoot on the porch, eyes closed, face tilted up to the sky. Water streamed from his hair, his shirt plastered to him. "You'll catch your death," she called. He opened his eyes and grinned, rain running down his jaw. Maybe I just needed to prove I'm still alive. Later she joined him. They stood together in the downpour, the rain washing everything that words never could. By late June, Bitter Creek had turned gold at its edges. Grass bent under the Sunday. The air shimmered with heat and cicadas. Silas spent the morning repairing the harness. Clara baked bread that filled the house with warmth and the smell of rosemary. When he came inside, she handed him a slice still steaming. "Careful," she said. "It's hot." He blew on it, tore it in half, gave the other piece back to her. "Then we'll burn together." She laughed, a sound that surprised them both. That night after supper, he said quietly, "You ever think of leaving here, going east again?" She shook her head. "There's nowhere else I'd belong." He studied her a moment. "When I first came here, I thought this cabin was a kind of penance. Now it feels like a promise kept." She looked at him over the lamplight. "Penance is what we owe. Promise is what we choose." He nodded slowly. "Then I'll choose it again." Outside the night settled soft and wide. The creek whispered, the wind carried the faint smell of grass and rain, waiting somewhere far off. By harvest time, the foal she'd raised was nearly grown. She named him Mercy. When he followed her down to the water's edge, she laughed at how clumsy he still was, legs too long for his understanding. Silas watched from the porch, a quiet contentment on his face. "You naming horses now," he teased. "Someone has to," she said, stroking the colt's neck. "You'd call him something like Trouble." "Wouldn't be wrong," he said. "Most good things start that way." When she walked back up the slope, he was still there, carving another bird from cedar. She took the first one, the one with the open wings, and hung it above the door. "For luck," she said. He smiled. "For flight." And for the first time, when the wind moved through the valley, the sound that rose from the wire fence wasn't mournful. It sang a low hum, like a note held in harmony. That winter's snow returned to Bitter Creek soft and measured. But the cabin was ready for it now. The roof held. The fire burned clean. The walls were lined with the smell of smoke and bread, of pine and wool and safety. One night, as the storm howled outside, Clara woke to find Silas by the fire, staring into the flames. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. He shook his head. "Sometimes I still hear it, the shot, the silence after. I think it'll fade, then it comes back." She went to him, sat beside him on the hearth. "Then let it come. You don't have to chase it away. Just let it burn itself out." He looked at her, the firelight flickering in his eyes. "You sure you want to build a life with a man who still dreams of the dead?" She took his hand. "You're the one who taught me the dead don't own what's still breathing." He leaned his head against hers, and for the first time in years, he let himself believe that peace wasn't a lie, just something that had to be built nail by nail, heartbeat by heartbeat. Spring came again. The world greened quickly this time, as if remembering how. The fence still stood. The birds returned to the eaves. Silas finished carving his third bird and set it beside the others on the shelf above the hearth. 3 small shapes of flight, each one different, none perfect. Clara placed a sprig of dried sage in a jar beside them. Now it's a home, she said. He smiled, looking around the cabin at the mended roof, the scarred table, the light coming in golden and forgiving. Guess it is. They stepped outside together. The air smelled of rain not yet fallen, of grass ready to grow. The sky stretched wide, the color of possibility. Clara leaned against the post they'd set the year before, tracing the groove of the wood with her thumb. "You ever think about how far we've come from who we were all the time," he said. "And it still doesn't feel far enough. Maybe it's not about distance." He looked at her. "What is it then?" She smiled, eyes soft. "Direction." He nodded, almost laughing. "That'll do." They watched the horizon for a while, two silhouettes side by side, no longer haunted, just human. And when the wind rose, it moved through the grass like a benediction, carrying with it the faint hum of the fence wire. The same sound that had once been sorrow now changed into something steadier. A song of work done, of mercy, mended, of a home rebuilt. Dawn at Bitter Creek. The last frost came and went in silence. The cottonwoods along the creek unfurled new leaves, pale as green glass. When dawn touched the valley, Bitter Creek shimmered, not cold, not empty anymore, but awake. Clara rose early. The air smelled of coffee and wet earth, the kind of scent that felt like starting over. She poured 2 cups, the steam curling soft in the pale light, and paused to listen. Just the long breath of the house, the low hum of wire out on the east line, the creek, telling a thin silver story behind the barn. Silas was already outside, mending the last rail of the corral. His coat hung loose at the shoulders, the scar on his hand silver in the Sunday. When he heard her step on the porch, he looked up as if dawn itself had spoken his name. "You're up early," she said. He smiled faintly. Old habits. The day don't wait for a man to forgive himself. She walked down to him, handing the tin cup. Their fingers brushed, a simple touch, steady now, no longer uncertain. He drank and let the warmth settle. "I was thinking," she said, glancing toward the horizon, where the sun climbed slow and gold, "about how I came here." He tilted his head. "Regret the journey? No. I think the road had to break me before I could stand still." She watched a hawk draw a quiet circle high above the pasture. "I came to marry a stranger. Seems I found one anyway, just not the one I expected." He took a longer sip, eyes on lights spilling across the field. "Maybe that's all any of us get, a second chance wearing the wrong name." Clara smiled. "If so, I'll take it." They finished the rail with a care that felt less like labor and more like a prayer done with hammers. When the gate swung true, he tested the latch twice, though it clicked right the first time. Some men needed the confirmation of sound. Silas needed the shape of a thing to answer back. Later that morning they rode to the ridge above town. The wind there was gentler now, carrying only the hiss of grass and the faint call of meadowlark. Below them, Bitter Creek lay small, and still, the cabin smoking like small prayers sent up by ordinary hands. Silas dismounted, first walking to where the ground dipped near a stand of willows. A simple marker stood there: Robert Callen, 1,845, 1,879. He knelt, resting his hat against his knee. "It's done," he said quietly. "They cleared your name." Clara stood beside him. Sunlight caught in her hair, turning it gold. "He'd be glad you stayed long enough to do it." Silas shook his head. "I don't think he'd want me living in his shadow." She placed her hand on his shoulder. "Then don't. Live in the light." He left. For a long while neither spoke. Wind walked the hill with careful feet. A grasshopper clicked. Somewhere downslope a calf bawled for a mother who was near enough not to worry yet. Grief at last felt like something that had found its right size. When they turned to go, Clara looked back once. The marker shone faintly in the new light, no longer a gravestone, just a piece of earth made honest. They rode slow to the cabin, letting the valley show them what morning meant, when it didn't have to prove itself. Fence wire singing a low, comfortable note, sage waking soft the creek, wearing sunlight like a second skin. That evening, back at the ranch, they sat on the porch steps. The sky burned soft orange. Cicadas hummed the old hymn of warm months. A pot of stew simmered inside, and the smell of bread drifted out through the open door, rosemary and heat, and the modest triumph of a home that fed its own. Silas leaned his elbows on his knees. Funny thing, he said. I used to think peace was something you had to earn with blood. Turns out it's quieter than that. She rested her head against his shoulder, quieter and harder to hold. He chuckled low. Reckon we'll manage? She turned to look at him, creased face, windburned skin eyes, steady and clear. For once there was no distance left between them, no ghost standing in the doorway. I think this is home, she said. He nodded. Then we'll build from here. The last light spilled across the porch, glinting off the new fence, the open field, the faint ribbon of the creek beyond. Somewhere a horse snorted softly. The world was settling. Clara reached for the coffee pot, poured the last of it into their cups. To second chances, she said. Silas touched his cup to hers, and to the strangers who became home. They drank, and the silence after was full, not empty anymore, but alive with the quiet promise of morning. Stars came out one by one, until the sky was a slow bloom of silver. In the distance, Bitter Creek whispered like a story almost finished. Days learned the shape of them. He rose before the light found the windows, and listened to the air like a reader who'd learned weather as language. She woke to kettles beginning to purr, to the thump of boots meeting boards, to the mild argument of doves in the cottonwoods. He taught Mercy the colt she'd named long-legged and earnest to mind gates and follow a soft hand. She taught the kitchen to behave like a generous neighbor bread that rose obediently, coffee that didn't boil into bitterness, a stew that waited warm without scolding if work ran long. In the middle hours, they fixed what the winter had left asking. He planed a stubborn door until it learned to shut without a sigh. She restitched the rag rug by the hearth, a bright river winding through squares of old shirts and retired skirts. Their talk had less need for explanation now. Hand me the 2-inch, he'd say, and she would without hunting. Mind the east light, she'd say, and he'd angle the table so the quilt saw its colors true. Evenings they sometimes rode to the south line where the wire met creek. There the land opened wide enough that even memory had room to breathe. He'd tell her the name of a hill not on any map. She'd tell him the name of a note not written in any hymnal, but sung by fence and wind in the last blue. You hear that, she'd ask. Low B, he'd say. More like the kind of bee a night makes when it's happy with itself. He'd pretend not to understand, and understand perfectly. On a Tuesday, that smelled of rain coming from somewhere far but certain, Sheriff Callen rode up with a short wave and a longer look. Brought you a thing, he said, passing down a folded notice, and a small packet sealed with wax. The notice was plain exoneration recorded. Claim records corrected. The packet held Robert's pocket watch, its crystal scratched from a life lived outdoors, its hands still moving like time itself had decided to keep him honest. He would have wanted you to have it, Callen said. Silas held the weight of it in his palm. He would have wanted the minutes used, he said, and laid the watch on the table, where morning light could touch it. Clara wound it, listened. The tick felt like a heartbeat too steady to be haunted anymore. When the sheriff left the road, held his dust lightly, as if even the land had learned to let a man go without taking a piece of him. The town adjusted the way towns do by repeating themselves until the repetition made sense. At the general store, Mrs. Portis began using Clara's first name and stopped adding pity at the end of it. The blacksmith Gerald, said Walker without looking for a fight inside the word. A boy in suspenders ran after them to return a dropped glove and did not ask for a coin. These were the small mercies that prove a place has agreed to your existence. They bought seed for a garden that didn't need to impress anybody. Beans, summer squash, 2 hills of corn, just for the joy of watching a straight green blade admit it wanted sky. We'll plant late, Clara said, so the frost doesn't get any ideas. Silas nodded and marked the rows with cord and a casual reverence usually saved for Sunday. On the way home they passed the boarding house, its porch freshly painted and lined with chairs, the color of ripe pears. Conversation paused as they rode by, then resumed, not with the old hush that follows a name fallen from favor, but with the ordinary hum people give to lives that refuse to break. At the ridge again they stopped at Robert's marker. Clara had tied a strip of muslin to the willow branch above it weeks back. The cloth had weathered into the color of rain itself. She touched the wood with 2 fingers and did not feel the old sharpness of grief. Do you think he'd like how simple we kept it? She asked. Silas nodded. He'd say stones already know how to preach, no sense adding more words. They stood until the wind finished its thought, then rode down as the valley began to gather its shadows without threatening to keep them. Dawn kept arriving on time. On a morning the color of unpolished silver, Mercy shoved his soft nose into Clara's shoulder until she laughed and forgot the list she'd been making. Silas watched, chin in hand, the look on his face equal parts fondness and amazed relief that a body could contain both at once. "You going to Red Mesa today?" she asked. "If you want me to." He said it as if the choice were hers, because it was. The days of deciding alone had ended without ceremony. "Pick up lamp oil," she said. "And if Portis has the good nails, the short ones, with the heads that don't turn slick." He tipped his hat. "Anything else? Bring back what the road tells you." He pretended to write it down with the air of a man whose pockets had learned the difference between paper and promises. When he returned at dusk, he brought the oil, the nails a length of calico, with shy blue flowers for a dress she wasn't sure she would ever need, and a story about a man on the boardwalk who remembered Silas from a place called Canyon Bluff and chose to shake his hand instead of look away. Some debts pay themselves, Silas said, and left it there. They ate peaches from a tin and laughed about the mule that insisted on untying itself whenever a sermon went longer than its patience. Mercy learned to take a bridle without making a case for suffering. The creek turned from meltwater to mirror and began to tell summer stars the truth about themselves. At the far edge of summer they hosted something small because small is what fit. Fallon came. Mrs. Portis came with a pie baked honest even if the crust decided to behave like a map of the territory instead of a circle. Gerald brought 2 iron hooks for the door that thinks it's special. 3 children from the West Slough brought a jar of lightning bugs and the conviction that they had invented wonder. They took the table outside and let it be long with boards that didn't match. They ate and did not drink more than made sense. Someone asked if they were married, and Clara said, "We are what we are." Silas said, "We're building," and nobody tried to improve either sentence. Near moonrise, Fallon asked for a word and took Silas down to the fence. "You know, Walker," he said, "I keep thinking of that day they cleared you. You didn't look free." Silas leaned on the top rail. The wires hummed a contented sound like metal at peace with tension. "Freedom's not the paper," he said. "It's the work you're willing to do after." "Paper's easier," Fallon said. Silas nodded. "That's why it needs posts." They looked out across the field, where the grass had decided it was evening, and let quiet finish the talk better than any man could. When the guests left, the valley took them back without ceremony. The porch held the day's last heat and released it into the night, like a secret, finally safe to tell. Clara gathered plates while Silas lifted the table inside. They moved around each other like a song that had found its chorus at last. "Did we do right?" she asked. "We did enough," he said. "Right takes more years than we've lived since March." She considered that. "Then let's give it years." "Deal," he said, and the word felt like something signed where wind couldn't tear it. Autumn edged the leaves with brass. The garden tired the good way. Mercy's legs caught up to his intent. The red willow slips they had tucked above the high water line took root and made a small summer that would only grow stronger for having known flood. Clara found herself singing sometimes not hymns exactly, but pieces of them, the useful lines about mercy and mourning about bread, enough and light that holds. Silas kept carving birds each with a different tilt to the wing and set them on the mantel where they learned to be a flock. On the first cold snap he nailed the hooks Gerald had forged. "For the door that thinks it's special," he said, and the door clicked as if to concede the point. The house tightened against weather. The two of them moved through it as if every beam had learned their names. On a night clear enough to hear frost, deciding she asked what he would have been if not a lawman. "Fence mender," he said, "which is just law with better manners. And if not a rancher, still a fence mender." She laughed into her scarf. "And if not a fence mender," he pretended to think hard. "Man who learns when to stop talking." "You're already terrible at that," she said kindly. And he loved her for turning truth into warmth. They stood under a sky hammered with stars, and the wire along the north line sang that low B she liked to argue with. After a while, she said, "It doesn't sound like sorrow anymore. What then? Something a body could sleep to." "Then we're close," he said, and meant not just to winter. The last frost came and went in silence again, the year making its circle without apology. The cottonwoods kept their promise to be green, where green would do the most good. Dawn touched the valley and found it ready. Clara poured 2 cups, the habit of a home that had learned how to expect joy. Silas was up before the kettle could finish. Some men are born to meet mornings halfway. He came to the door with his hat in his hands like a blessing asked and given. "You hear it?" he asked. "The creak? The fence? It's got a new tone." She listened. The hum had shifted warmer somehow, as if the posts had taken the last of winter into themselves and decided to make music of it. "I hear it," she said. "Sounds like staying." They ate bread at the threshold because thresholds had saved them. The day built itself like something held by an honest frame. "Ride into town?" he asked. "After the wash," she said. "The shirts won't hang themselves." He grinned. "Town can wait. Shirts are less patient." And so the morning went chores. That proved time could be trusted talk. That meant the silence between sentences had learned not to be afraid. Near noon they hitched the wagon and rolled in. People waved, because that is what a town does when it has forgiven what it understands and decided to hold what it doesn't. They traded for lamp wicks and salt. A child with a freckled nose held Mercy's lead rope with a reverence normally reserved for angels and puppies. Mrs. Portis added an extra spool of thread and said it must have fallen into the sack by accident. They agreed to help her keep her accounting honest by paying next time. On the way home they stopped at the ridge once more. The willow by Robert's marker had added a hand's width of green. The muslin ribbon had weathered to softness and did not look like sorrow anymore. Only like cloth being what cloth is. "Thank you, Clara," said, not to the stone, not quite to the man beside her, but to the space that had opened between the two and made a life. Silas put a palm flat to the post, feeling the pulse that wood and earth sometimes keep if a man will be still enough to notice. "We'll keep it," he said. "Best we can." They drove down slow. Afternoon leaned itself over the valley in a way that made promise seem like an ordinary word again. Mercy tossed his head because youth and hills agree on certain points. The cabin came into view, smoke-roof door with honest hooks, a line of shirts working at becoming dry. On the porch, Clara set the kettle on and turned the watch key once-twice. The tick caught sure. She looked around the room. Birds on the mantel. The lockbox on the shelf closed but not hidden. The table nicked by years that were finally on their side. She breathed and felt the house breathe back. Silas came in hat to peg hands washed at the basin. He stood as if measuring the space only to make sure his gratitude fit without needing to be trimmed. "You look like a man with a notion," she said. "I was thinking," he answered slowly, "how a place begins to look like the people who refuse to leave it. And do we look like this place yet? Every day, a little more." He reached for the coffee, and she for the cups. Outside a breeze lifted, and the wire answered in that low, faithful tone. The creek added a second voice. Crickets rehearsed for a season not quite here. They sat on the steps again because some positions become vows without saying the word. He looked at her profile drawn in afternoon, at the way her hands knew where to rest, without being told at the line of the fence, catching light, like a line in a hymn that always lands true. She looked at him and did not see a badge or a mistake or a penance. She saw the man who kept promises the way fence posts keep wire. To second chances, she said the phrase made new by use. He touched his cup to hers. And to the strangers who became home, they drank. The day finished without rushing. Evening unclasped the valley like a button. Stars arrived and did not demand attention, merely presence. The wire hummed its note and held it. The creek told its story to the dark and was believed. And when they rose at last to go inside, it wasn't because the night needed ending. It was because morning had already started somewhere on the far side of the ridge and had sent word ahead. "Be ready. I'm coming the way I always do."